Okay, we are live. I mean, you people aren't going to see us live, but we are live, as it were, figuratively and literally. This is probably, how many of these have we done now? There's probably, we've done at least half a dozen, have we not? I mean, I'm
Feels
genuinely
like it.
curious.
We've
Yeah,
I
not
think we're
just,
under 10 actually, which is
yeah, but we've got to have had at least half a dozen. I'm not just looking to provide filler. I'm genuinely curious, but no, that's great. Today, the topic is one that I think is important, just conceptually. Um, whatever the whatever the issue under discussion is, whether it's a policy issue, whether it's something metaphysical, whether we're talking about ethics, no matter what we're talking about, there's a penumbric kind of character to it, quality to it. Forgive the highfalutin language. I can't think of a better way to characterize it. Ace raised the point, and other people who I respect in terms of their observational kind of aptitude is that there's a real problem in discursive culture generally, but particularly in this country and at present with identifying uh, terms and terminology and definitions. What exactly are we talking about? And words carry a great power in all cultures, in all places. They carry taboos. Sometimes they have the power to inflame passions, and they have the power more than that these days because we live kind of in an era where rationalism is a cult unto itself. Notice I didn't say rationality; I said rationalism. There's this cult of rationalism that employs the language of science to obscure things rather than clarify them, or to mischaracterize things that otherwise should be very easy to interpret and describe and recognize, particularly human things, stuff like, relating to sexuality or relations between the sexes or stuff like ethnicity, things that should be understandable in very basic terms are obscured and obfuscated very deliberately. And this is done so under this kind of rationalist pseudoscientific language. And this this began really in the 20th century when this tendency was really originated, I think, with Hobbes. And I don't want to go too far afield, but I will bring this back. But I made the point a long time ago on Babcast that Hobbes, in a lot of ways, was the father of liberalism with a capital L. Like, people don't think that way because Hobbes is very much an authoritarian. They associate him with the War of Three Kingdoms. They associate him subsequently with, the kind of benevolent dictatorship, or not so benevolent, depending on where you fall, of Cromwell. But Hobbes' account of man and how man comes to exist socially and the origins of politics, that there was very much a liberal rationalist paradigm that he presented. That's what I mean. And but obviously, in the 17th century, most people were not literate. So this didn't have, you had an elite kind of coterie of people to whom these kinds of concepts held great sway over, but the common man in the street, the proverbial street, in those days was the man in the prairie. Probably there weren't really streets as we know them, but he still basically informed, his conceptual horizon was basically informed by empirical things and instinctive things, and just kind of basic human responses that were very tangible and very sensory, not sensual but sensory, and sometimes sensual. But what happened in the 20th century, it's not an accident that both progressives and Bolsheviks, at the turn of the century, they were really big proponents of literacy, not just because they had this idea that, well, if we can teach little boys and girls to read, then they'll lead better lives, and we'll be able to identify people's intellectual talents better, and we can create more complex structures that serve the common good. I mean, yeah, that was an aspect of it, but the main impetus for these political ideologues and these political soldiers was, they wanted to be able to convey ideas in a certain way. They wanted to create a conceptual horizon, and you create conceptual horizons with words. And when you begin to describe what amounts to political things, or things that have been politicized deliberately in these pseudoscientific and rationalist terms, it allows you to really obfuscate what those things are and their essential nature. I come back to the point again and again that it's very deliberate. It's not some middling point or something that, in lieu of the term sex, people use gender. Like, an organism can't have a gender. A word has a gender. Okay, an organism has a sex, and there's only two. This idea that, well, no, this isn't actually a binary paradigm of biological reality, and that deals with physical structures, and at the cellular and chromosomal level, and at the morphological level, but that it's actually a category of mind, and it's on this spectrum that's very fluid. There's all these different genders. That's just one example. The way language came to be employed in the 20th century also caused people who wanted to rebut this sort of perspective to adapt this language, and some of that had to do with the kind of splendid triumph. By splendid, I don't mean good. I mean as a euphemism for absolute. This kind of splendidly absolute triumph of the left in the battleground of ideas after World War II, because by force of arms they had triumphed. The ideological left really developed the ability to kind of impose the parameters of discourse, not just what is ethically acceptable, but the terms in which things are understood and the way concepts are defined and described. So what passes for the right really began to do that too. And one of the ways they tried to return the proverbial serve was to try to vilify certain concepts near and dear to the left that were employed by them, so as to kind of draw an axiomatic connotation between those terms and concepts and negativity. And forgive the long introduction, but I think it was warranted. No more is this more evident than in the term socialism. Nobody can really tell you what that means in this country, even intelligent men in the street. Everybody's got kind of their own conception of what it entails and why it's bad, but nobody can really break down or unpack the particulars of what it is and why it is bad and what it was emergent from. And I think that that's very deliberate. Now, of course, part of that is because I don't think socialism, as envisioned around the turn of the 20th century, has the same kind of context that it did before. Okay, because it really was a radical notion then, and its emergence, both conceptually and sympathy for it, as a policy idea, came about due to revolutionary conditions. Those sorts of things are not underway now. So I think it's somewhat difficult for people to grasp the true meaning of something like socialism. But on top of that, there's also this veneer of punitive association very deliberately crafted around it. Now, I'm not sitting here and saying like you should like socialism or that it's this very good thing. It's really neither good nor bad. I take the kind of Joseph Schumpeter's view. It's one of those things in political terms that becomes inevitable. The tragedy of the commons is that, anytime political power is extricated from the person of a monarch or a dynasty that has a vested interest in preserving the value of the realm, that value becomes something to be bargained away, okay? And you can basically buy the electorate with it. And obviously, because there's not endless wealth, at some point that process is going to exhaust itself. And even men with the best intentions, they're going to bargain, they're going to use the national wealth and the public coffers as a bargaining chip in order to achieve the mandate that they need in order to implement what they feel is, the correct policy. But the fact is, no matter how correct those policies may be, these policies cost the same as those of the opposition. That is my introduction to today's topic. Do you think you want me to continue, or do you think that that's a reasonably good summation?
Yeah, I think there's a few things there you mentioned. First of all, citing Hobbes, I think, is very worthwhile, since in a standard philosophy class, as you said, a lot of teachers would probably summarize his legacy as defending monarchy, defending authoritarianism, in the sense of, authoritarianism just means putting authority as the top priority and order as a primary concern. So, that's another, when we're talking about language, authoritarian is another term that is often misused for partisan reasons. But what you said about his materialistic view of the world is often a problem, because he's kind of leaning into what many might say are his atheist leanings. And so I would say that is kind of a shortcoming of his worldview. And as you said, kind of what Descartes said about doubt is also kind of present in Hobbes's worldview. This idea that there is those dichotomies, and maybe there's something spiritual that could be added. There's something that outside of that materialistic worldview, it sort of neglects the what would be the Kantian philosophy. And so I think Hobbes is kind of missing a lot of those things that I think are essential in philosophy. But if we were to categorize philosophy from ancient Greece to the Enlightenment, I think modern philosophy is contingent on language, and with movements like the 20th century, positivists, I think that sort of is our modern day topic. And, whereas Kant has been neglected, whereas religion, to say the least, has been neglected in the past few decades, I think we can sort of, maybe in a nostalgic way, sort of revive Kantian philosophy and just kind of, bring those things to the forefront. Whereas, today we're focusing more on sort of language. I think we can bring language to the forefront and some of the, more spiritual sides of philosophy that maybe Hobbes may not have been interested, but could have benefited from.
Oh yeah, definitely. And what's interesting to me about Hobbes too, I look at Hobbes, there's been a resurgence of interest in Carl Schmitt. I mean, not just within our circles, but generally. I've observed this over the past, say, like 12 years, and that's kind of fascinating to me. And I view Schmitt's relationship to Hobbes kind of like I do Marx's relationship to Hegel. Schmitt was very, very fixated. I don't use that term punitively, fixated. He was very focused on Hobbes' account of executive power and the way that it's viewed in almost theological terms. But he turned Hobbes's view of man and man's original state on its head. Because, Hobbes had this idea that man was just this kind of like isolated, discrete integer who was just born not to an ethnicity, not to a family, not to a tribe. Like man was just kind of this atomized individual floating in this, sort of nothing. And, he consciously decided to enter into, alliances of sorts with others, out of self-interest or mutual benefit or, hope of some kind of reciprocity. It's a totally anti-human way of approaching the world. Okay. I mean, it's just not how humans behave, and that's not how human sympathies originate. And that's not the reason why people are attached to their family or their extended relations or their ethnicity or their culture or anything like that. It's a peculiar blind spot, but it was very deliberate. I mean, there's a whole movement towards this to try and scientize human affairs. I mean, E. Michael Jones gets into this a lot, and that some of his stuff is like very esoteric to people who it's like it's Aquinas versus Newton and things like that. And I'm not a Catholic, and I don't get into the subtext of some of these incredibly nuanced church fathers versus these early scientists and things. But there is some facsimile of that in Carl Schmitt, and that's one of the reasons he spends so much time with Hobbes. And yeah, I agree with you. Ultimately, our goal as people of the right, I mean, regardless of whatever your discrete sympathies are within that spectrum, yeah, I agree with you. We've got to bring philosophy back to what Kirk called first things and God and spirituality. But we also need to attack the kind of more day-to-day concrete aspects of what's become kind of pop university philosophy. And language is a huge component of that. But even more pragmatically, it was weird to me, like kind of the prime example of the boogeyman word in America to this day. It's is socialism. And that's weird because as a guy who, kind of came of age as the Cold War ended, it's weird people still talk in those terms. And it's like, well, what exactly are we talking about? By some metrics, Prussia, which was about the most right-wing state you can imagine, was an incredibly socialist state. Like, is socialism, set aside for people of a certain race under auspices of, remedial justice? Is socialism saying that, okay, old people get a pension after they're 67 years old? Is socialism what the Japanese do and saying like, well, we want to privilege our workers over that of, those of other countries and protect wages, however artificially. So, we're going to pick certain firms and certain and certain industrial concerns and, subsidize them basically, even to the point of allowing them to operate at a loss, for a certain period of time to make sure that they can remain competitive. Nobody can actually tell me what socialism is in this country. And one of the reasons why it's not just the incoherency of people's, idiosyncratic definitions of it is because it doesn't really have a context in America, and context is everything. And really what socialism is, like Werner Sombart, who I think everybody should read. I mean, wherever you fall in the political spectrum, I know he's considered to be a right-wing thinker, and I guess that's fair. I mean, in comparative terms, yeah, he was right-wing for his era, but Sombart made the point, look, here's the reason why most people become socialists, and he's speaking, in the early 20th century, okay? People don't become socialists because, they're people like Rosa Luxemburg or like Lenin, and because they've got some grand, revolutionary view of how things should be ordered. They become socialists, partisan socialists in terms of like they do at the polls and whatever, and, the parties they support, because they've got, in some cases an immediate, and in almost all cases an ancestral memory that in Europe, there was a real interdependence between the classes in Europe, and Europe had actual classes. Like when we talk about a class system in America, we're not really talking about the same thing. We're talking about people in different professions who have more money than others. We're talking about people who, owing to their patterns of living and patterns of marriage, and again, the kinds of professions they work at, they approach the world differently, have different values, but there's a lot more fluidity there, and it's a lot more based on money. Like in Europe, there really was a caste system, and there really were barriers between these people. at the same time, there was an interdependence between these people. Like, you may be a serf, in old Europe, but the lord of the manor, he was responsible basically for feeding and clothing you, providing you with labor. He was responsible for raising an army when you had to collectively be defended. If you had a controversy at law with another serf, you basically both had to approach him, in order to implement justice. You couldn't. And in contrast, I mean, the lord of the manor needed these serfs to, till the fields and till the soil. One way to think of it in American terms is, okay, the lord of the manor did the brain work, and the serfs did, the muscle work. But and there was tensions between these people, of course, but they needed each other. And there's an understanding that they, by necessity as well as by, morals and by right, they had to sacrifice for one another. Well, all of a sudden in Europe, and in a very punctuated way, in the Second Industrial Revolution, all that really got blown up. There was no more lord of the manor. If you were a serf, suddenly you find yourself in a city and you're going to work in a factory, with 10,000 other people whose, ancestors were serfs, both immediate and remote. Who do you appeal to for justice? Well, there's a guy who owns that factory, but he doesn't care about you. You're like, there's 10,000 other men who can do your job. And plus, he doesn't know who the hell you are anyway. And why would he owe you something? He's paying you for your labor. And theoretically, you can walk off this job anytime you want and sell your labor to somebody else. This was very, very frightening to people, particularly because really, if you became injured, or if you otherwise during a bus cycle, in terms of the demand for these manufacturers you were laboring at to produce, if you could not find someone to sell your labor to, you were just going to die. There was no lord of the manor to kind of provide that paternal justice in a social sense. Okay, and yeah, admittedly, I'm not trying to idealize, the medieval structure. There was good things about it, and there was very bad things about it. But that's not important. What's important is that for hundreds of years, for millennia, really, this is what people were habituated to do, and suddenly they were ripped out of that. So the whole point of socialism, in terms of the man in the street, I'm saying, not in terms of it as a philosophy, was, well, we're going to take that power that vested in the lord of the manor, or that vested in the personage of the king or the queen, and we're going to vest that power in the state, which is an abstraction, but, the state is basically going to hold wealth in common and provide for us, just, the way the king used to, or the way the lord used to. That's why socialism gained traction. And that's why Europeans viewed it as somewhat value neutral. You had guys like National Socialists, and despite people like Noam Chomsky says, the people who followed Adolf Hitler viewed themselves as socialists. This wasn't some sort of insidious trick to try and get people to vote the wrong way at the polls. I mean, these guys were socialists, okay? They had an idea that, based on, situation of history, racial survival, the inherent moral duty that people within, of common, German ethnicity had to one another, for myriad reasons different than those of, the secular left would have had. They did believe in socialism. What's fascinating is how in America it's associated exclusively with the left and used as a pejorative. And like even people on the left who probably are in actual terms, advocating socialist principles, not ethically, but materially, they try and distance themselves from that moniker because it's almost always invoked as a term of abuse. And that's really interesting. Though it makes sense. But again, like I said too, what exactly are people talking about? Like I haven't worked a 9-to-5 job for a long time, but like one of my last 9-to-5 jobs was I worked for a Kroger. And I worked overnight, like in receiving, but I was also like a butcher. Like I actually am like a nativist, like Protestant butcher, which is kind of funny. But gangs in New York. Like I don't know if you picked up on the reference, but in any event, when I got laid off by Kroger after I'd been there like a year and a half, I got workers' comp, or not workers' comp, unemployment. But in every state, I mean, I know you're in California, I'm in Illinois, but everybody in every state, pays into unemployment. So it's like, is that socialism? That's not socialism because you're giving me back money I paid into it. But there's people who would say, like hardline libertarians, like, well, that's ridiculous, and you're relying on the government to basically act as like a savings plan for you, when it's, if you want some sort of guarantee against, being unemployed, you should sock away your money in CDs or bonds that, have meaningful returns, or at least enough that, to float you through the hard times when, there's not, enough work to go around or whatever. But I mean, my point is that, to some people, any iteration, even if I as a taxpayer have like paid into the system, any iteration of government management of public wealth that was once that was derived from private earnings, to some people that's socialism. To some people, socialism is nothing is socialism short of this kind of Marxist Leninist abolition of private means of production. If we can even talk about means of production anymore, I kind of chuckle when I hear that term anymore, because it's what the hell are means of production in the 21st century? I'm talking about in America or Western Europe, not in places like China or Africa. But you know what I mean. I mean, forgive the rant, but yeah, that's kind of the most striking example. I mean, there's the woke types play all kinds of games with language, but that's almost too kind of silly and incoherent to translate to policy terms. But yeah, the big kind of signifier, floating signifier, as it were, that jumps out to me is socialism, especially during election years. I mean, does that make any sense to you, or was that just a rant?
Yeah, well, in terms of philosophy, I would say that the 20th century was defined by ideology, and I see that as a detriment to its contribution to philosophy in the 20th century. The fact that places where the French Revolution occurred and a lot of European philosophy was in two world wars, I think that's also probably the reason why a lot of our modern philosophy is contingent on language and these sort of ideological roads that I think we saw in the 20th century weren't really successful in the long run, and were kind of a fool's errand, I would say. But I think another aspect of it was the fact that a lot of the intellectuals of the 20th century were these economic types. And you being from Chicago, you are definitely familiar with a lot of these types. And the fact that they had a monopoly on the political vocabulary, I think that's what kind of set us on this road of, and I kind of want to get into more of this later on, but the pop politics, the sort of pop side of the I was going to bring up Mark Levin's American Marxism book, which was kind of a good example of sort of these words that are kind of used in these really weird modern ways. But yeah, I would just attribute a lot of the downfall of philosophy and the downfall of getting us away from Kant and the religious aspects that I think people should return to. I would attribute that to people replacing it with ideology as this top priority and this thing that people should strive for, which I would see as a fool's errand. But what do you think about that?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, it's also too, it's weird. I don't want to go off track, but I think it's material to the discussion. There's something very 20th century about this too. I mean, like even among young guys, it's not just like guys my age and genuinely old guys. To your point, talking about policy issues with these kind of ideological conceptual biases. It's young people, and these things were like the planned society failed. I mean, the 20th century was anomalous in a lot of ways. I mean, that's why, I bring up Eric Hobsbawm a lot, and people think that's peculiar sometimes, and they remind me of how ugly the man was. And yes, Eric Hobsbawm was in fact a very ugly man. I stipulate that. But aside from the fact Hobsbawm was not, the winner of any beauty contest, he was a big Stalinist, and he even during the kind of 1968 split of the American left, when all these kinds of crazy bougie types decided they were Maoists or something. Hobsbawm stuck by the Soviet Union, and specifically he continued to defend Stalin. But Hobsbawm referred to the 20th century as the short century, and he used to talk about how anomalous it was. Because of the disruption of revolution, of truly global warring, of technics, of the emergence of the atomic age, all of these things, but also the ability of the state to corral and to assert its dominion over virtually every aspect of life, as well as to corral mass amounts of data, and to quite literally plan everything from people's work and living patterns and how they travel and how they eat, to in the case of the Soviet Union and the DDR, literally planning the economy. That was a remarkable experiment in a bad way, but it was an abject failure, not just for political reasons, although arguably, I mean, in my opinion, the political aspect of it was the paramount cause of its failure. But the material side of it too, and the calculative side, the planned society just doesn't work. So it's weird when I hear about like woke types talking about like, oh well, we need social justice and we need to make sure we need to close this the disparity between rich and poor. It's like, okay, let me approach that in value neutral terms. Like, how do you propose to do that? Where do you think wealth comes from? They talk about wealth like it's like this thing. Go with me on this. It sounds like a weird analogy, but in 2001, the Stanley Kubrick movie, there's like these monoliths that this alien intelligence just deposits. Like there's one on the moon, there's one on Earth. Okay, it's like the woke, they talk about wealth like it's like this monolith. It's just like this thing that's like there, and that you just like kind of stumble across it, and then some class, or whether it's like white men, or whether it's rich people, or whether it's capitalists. It's like their ideas that this thing called wealth is just there, or like this monolith, and some class just grabs it, and it's like they don't talk about it like it's a commodity or a series of or a collection of commodities that derive from human labor, or derive from like at least the humans assigning value to it. But the whole notion that aside from that kind of imperfect analogy, this entire idea somehow that, well, this can be remedied because if we implement the correct policy plan, there's a gap between rich people and poor people will just shrink. I mean, that's not like you're really talking about apocalyptic forces. I mean, yeah, there's obviously there's ways that governments mismanage affairs that can make people poor, absolutely. And there's ways that people who are insinuated into the power structure can become very, very wealthy without actually producing anything of value. Okay, that goes without saying. But these people on both sides of this spectrum, those are the minority. This idea that just if I have enough inputs, and if I have enough data, and if I have the correct kind of moral orientation, I can just arrange affairs so that there's more equity between what people earn according to the effort they put forth, or that there's somehow less of a gap between people who have more wealth and people who have less wealth. Like how would that even be accomplished? Like even in a tabula rasa kind of way, like how would we accomplish this? And it owes the fact that conceptually this is the language of the 20th century, kind of being necromanced into the 21st century, where it's not even possible to implement these things. In the 20th century, it could be implemented. It had horrible consequences, and it was entirely imperfect, and it could not function as was declared that it could, according to the theorists who gave rise to these kinds of conceptual paradigms, but there's not even a context for these terms anymore. Like, does that make any sense? I mean, this really jumps out at me, I think, as somebody who's turning into kind of an older person. It's really, really weird when I hear some like 28-year-old like guy who's like working on his PhD like talk like some 1940s, like social democrat from, West Germany or something. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, what does that even mean? It's like, where do you live? Is there like a big local factory where like half the city you live in works? And it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's one thing for something to not really be feasible in policy terms. It's another thing entirely for it to not even really have a conceptual basis any longer. But I don't know, man. I mean, maybe that's what people like Orwell were trying to tell us. I think Orwell is oversighted. I'm not a great fan of his, although I do acknowledge his brilliance in some ways. But I mean, that was his point, is that at some point in modern government structures or any highly scaled structure, it's people bandying terms back and forth that don't have, that don't have like a real world iteration of what these terms supposedly represent. Forgive the rant.
No problem. And to bring it back to Kant, I think we are seeing
Yeah.
right now on full display the limits of pure reason, as Kant would say. There is a limit to this sort of mechanical view of the world where we can just kind of solve anything and not taking all the factors into account. I think that's where we're getting all the oversimplification. And to bring up the sort of the modern intellectuals, back in the 60s, there was William F. Buckley, and he was purging a lot of the sort of the unorthodox ideologies at the time, and to cite Stephen from Radical Liberation, which I was watching his channel a week or two ago, who I think he's a cool guy. But
Yeah.
I just want to mention that, people like him didn't really have a space in political conversations back in the 60s. And I mean, really today too, because before Mises, Buckley was the gatekeeper and had the monopoly on language. And that's where neoliberalism is kind of this very strong influence in the 70s, with Milton Friedman kind of dictating, trying to put morality into economics, when I think you would agree economics is just sort of a structure system. It's like science, it's a methodology. And so trying to insert morality into that, that's where you start to get the partisan angle and sort of this political angle. It's like when Marxists try to use morality to explain the immorality of capitalism, even though they don't really want to be metaphysical, but nobody's really there to filter or correct all of that. You just hear that one side of it. And so you get a lot of these confusing, definitions, or half definitions rather, because nobody's there to filter it out. There's not great shows like this to kind of set everything in a proper way. So
I don't know. That's an important. It's interesting you raise that. I mean, people think I'm really hard on the von Misesians because like I said on AA's stream the other week, I'm kind of like a Frederick List, Joseph Schumpeter, like Pat Choate kind of guy. I'm like an economic nationalist. I'm something of like a soft monetarist. I'm definitely a supply sider. But the von Misesians, one thing I do agree with them about is traditional von Misesians, they're very much against economic modeling. And there is something to that, because economics is not a science. Okay, economics is not physics. Economics is not biology. You're talking about aggregate human decision making. And I mean, I won't rule out that I got a strong interest in game theory and stuff, albeit on the more kind of 20th century strategic side of its application. But I'm certainly not going to rule out that aggregate decision making, if you have an adequate sample of inputs, I don't deny that economic outcomes can be predicted, but that doesn't make economics itself a science. And I mean that's the problem with a lot of current thinking, and that's one of the reasons why rationalism and its kind of more primitive bastard offspring, scientism today, which really has nothing to do with science, even though it thinks it does. That's part of this demand. I realized part of the. I was thinking about this the other day, and I was talking to like a lady who's a friend of mine, not romantically or anything. I mean, she's a writer too, but she and I were talking about these people on the left who always seem so angry, and she's like, well, they think that there's she was talking about like what their worldview is. She's like, they think that there's a science of economics that can just be calculated, by which, everybody could have, really as much wealth as they could handle, but that, the masters of the science are just keeping it away from them, or keeping it away from the quarters of policy, or keeping it for themselves. And I mean, she wasn't really kidding. I mean, it sounds funny when you phrase it that way, because it sounds like some Dutch missionary being, held captive by, witch doctors and them demanding that he make it rain or something. But it really is not that far off from that. And I think that's what they believe. It's like, they, what do you mean there's a recession? What do you mean this is a, what do you mean you can't indefinitely maintain like 0% interest rates? Like, what do you mean you can't just like print more money and give it to people? It doesn't, they don't understand that you're talking about, first they're talking about something very delicate, but, we're talking about aggregate human decisions, and we're talking about perceptions within the minds of the people who make those decisions, millions of them. We're not talking about, guys standing in front of a chalkboard and saying, okay, here is how we make wealth, and if we just build, the infrastructure to distribute it, here is how everybody gets wealth, like whatever that means. Plus, I think the very definition of wealth changes. Like I'm always making the point. I was making the point on my timeline earlier today because somebody posted, somebody on YouTube posted, some footage from Englewood, which is a pretty rough hood here in Chicago. And it was these kind of, like tough looking black guys, like obviously, kind of, walking or flexing, like even tough. So those YouTube comments are like, oh, those, obviously none of those bastards have a job. Go get a job. It's like, bro, like those guys probably make more money than a lot of you. I mean, given they're doing it pushing heroin, but it's like these guys' problem is they're not acting that way because they're poor or because like they don't have access to capital. I'm like, that's not, and it's like, what is, and it's like, what is a deprived community anyway? Like if I went to the average deprived community, I guarantee you these guys own like more shit than I do. I mean, part of that's just because I'm kind of a minimalist, but it's like, okay, how do you define wealth? Do you define wealth as like, your knowledge and, your, and your ability, to apply knowledge in order to create things of value, like say like a carpenter or like a plumber or something, or, is wealth like the amount of like clothes I own to like get me through the cold winter? Is it the amount of fertile women I can access? Is it the amount of shotgun shells I have? Like, I realize I'm being silly, but it's like, these kinds of things don't even have like a real definition that's agreed upon. So like, even if we could talk about, resolving inequality, by scientific means, according to that, fiction, like we just discussed, that I told you about my lady friend and I kind of banning about, like, what would the, what would the end product of that be? Like, what is the good that would be distributed? Like nobody can explain that, and so then they fall back on other terms like, oh, well, you just say that because, you refuse to accept the reality of racism. It's like, okay, but like, but it's like, what do you mean by racism? Okay. It's like, and again, too, are we, if we're talking about something like racism or classism, or are we talking about people being deprived of material things? Like in Brown v. Board, Gunnar Myrdal claimed that the primary issue is that you're forcing people to feel inferior if you segregate them. What is interesting is Brown v. Board doesn't really talk about material poverty. People generally don't read legal decisions, but I realize I'm rambling, but it's just, I'm trying to make a point about how these definitions, not only are they tailored to obscure conceptual reality, but at the brass tacks, even they don't even really mean anything even if we accept what the declarant is trying to accomplish, if that makes any sense. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
it leads to a bizarre kind of like anti-discourse, especially in America.
right. And when you're talking about wealth, that's also a materialistic worldview. It's a very reductionist worldview. So, and
Yeah.
people on the left seem to understand this, and also Christians do too. There's no virtue in wealth in itself. There's no virtue in people having lots of stuff. And, the idea that that sort of defines a lot of the metaphysical territory, you know, you would probably be right to say that a lot of those people aren't really concerned with metaphysical territory. And so that's kind of the problem here is, we're the wealth being this sort of endpoint doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because obviously, people that are interested in the show are invested in something, much more greater than stuff like that.
What was fascinating, and I think about this a lot, and I make this point, and sometimes people get mad because they think I'm being condescending or making fun of them, but I'm not. There's this independent movie I really like with Guy Pearce called The Rover. It's one of those post-apocalyptic films, but it's interesting and it's really kind of biblically inspired in some ways, but it's not clear exactly what happened, but it takes place in the Australian outback. And there's been some kind of cataclysm because civilizations basically come apart. People just live in these kind of small communities. They're kind of like living off of the shell of the civilization that existed before. Yet, and so the guy who's kind of the main character, he's always in search of stuff like toilet paper. He's always in search of ammunition that's chambered for the weapons he has. A sharp knife, like stuff that is actual wealth. But people are still willing, even though there's no more national governments and there's still no more banks guaranteeing the notes the issue, people still demand you pay them in dollars. And at one point, I think if he tries to like trade a guy like some ammunition, the guy's like, no, I want Australian or American dollars. And the guy's like, it's just paper. Like it doesn't have, there's not a bank anymore. It's just paper. And like the guy like doesn't get it. Like it's and it's the example of, the Spanish Empire, I believe I could be wrong, but I believe that Lord Nelson, when he sank the Spanish Armada, I know some historian's going to weigh in and probably correct me on this, but it was either at that time or immediately before. The Spanish Empire had more gold reserves than any other country on earth, any other kingdom. They had an obscene amount of gold in comparative terms. But like, how did that help them? You can't you can't build rifles out of gold. Like you can't. If I hand a guy like a gold bar, he doesn't become like a brilliant engineer. Like I can't. You collecting specie or collecting money is meaningless unless it's backed up by some kind of actual wealth that's going to allow you, to purchase in a fungible way, like the things that you don't have, or to entice the people that you need to assist in whatever you need them to do. And in the case of states, generally that's warfare. But it's, yeah, this idea that wealth is reducible to either to currency or to some singular commodity doesn't really make any sense. That's not to say that there are not some people, in other parts of the world who are desperately poor, because there are, but that generally owes to failed societies. It's not because there's some single commodity they're being deprived of, or there's not the correct formula being implemented. I don't know. And plus too, it's it's most men's lot, frankly, to be poor. That in absolute terms, in planetary terms, people can come to terms with that or not. And to your point, I don't know what's so. There's something horrible about deprivation, absolutely. Like people not having enough to eat, or people, being exposed to the elements. But beyond that, it's never really been clear to me like what kind of great stuff people derive from wealth, whatever that means. you're better off if you can buy as many T-shirts and Chinese made sneakers as you want. So, like, I don't like what are people getting out of this? I don't. That's never really been clear to me. But what do I know? Wealth used to be like the land you can till, not because land itself is this incredible thing. It's because if you have arable land and you've got some aptitude for agriculture and animal husbandry, well, I mean, you can feed yourself and you can make a living like without anybody telling you what to do. I mean, that was the goal for a long time. I'm talking for centuries. Like the idea is like I'm going to be a freehold farmer and own my own land, so no one can literally lord over me. That's what wealth used to be. And that's I think that's very poignant. Because now it's really kind of the opposite. People 300 years ago would look at a guy, they look at say like Mr. Trump or like Bill Gates and be like, what do you mean that guy's wealthy? Like because he can buy things, like that's ridiculous. Like that man, like he'd starve to death if it wasn't for other people and their willingness to do business with him. I mean, I realize I'm making somewhat facetious, but the point stands. I think it's remarkable.
Yeah, and I think the perfect example of the, sort of that worldview, I think, is embodied with Ayn Rand and her sort of hyper individual, hyper classical liberal view of the world. I think is her philosophy really kind of embodies a lot of those aspects, and I think she's almost like I mean, I know her fictional characters are based off her and her experiences, but she really is like a comic book character of 20th century American, 20th century worldview that is still, causing influence today. And so that's that kind of this sort of hyper individualism where people view themselves as God. I think that is sort of, she sort of kind of summarizes that. If you would agree with that.
Yeah, and it's just a weird. It's weird that people get taken in by that. I mean, I understand why people get taken in by the Nietzschean worldview, particularly amidst the kind of alienation of the mid 19th through the 20th century, when it was kind of at its zenith. I think some of that has been mitigated, bad as things are today in the 21st century. But I mean, Nietzsche's notion is inextricably bound up with culture and value creation. Like Ayn Rand, it basically, I mean, there's something incredibly corny about it, but it's also, I mean, at the end of the day, like, okay, the Randian Superman isn't like the Nietzschean Alexander the Great. Like the Randian Superman is like what he has to pat himself on the back every day about how great he is that he built the factory. I mean,
selfish.
like what is, if you're not and I've made this point to people before too. America's not in real terms, America's not particularly individualistic. I used to argue about this point with a friend of mine. It was the Prussian army that invented mission-oriented tactics. It wasn't the Americans, it wasn't the British. It was the supposedly like conformist, Germans who can't think for themselves, who trusted their NCOs to basically plan and execute operations in the field. The what the Germans had going for them and why they conquered Europe from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow was that it's understood that people have to work together for the common good while also cultivating, an inner dynamism within people that gives rise to initiative. This idea that man is self-contained and the cream only rises to the top when freed of any restraint upon appetite and the pursuit of appetite. I mean that doesn't create that's like the opposite of culture. It's almost like glandular. It's I've never understood. I mean, aside from the fact that it's kind of the Randian stuff. It's kind of a caricature of itself, and that woman herself was a ridiculous person. And it's like, why does this appeal to anybody? Like, it doesn't. Most and there's something cultic. It's almost like Scientology, like to me. Like, and that was obviously that's kind of the milieu from which she emerged. Like that. The mid 20th century, there was those kinds of weird, almost almost kind of cartoony, like, you know, futurist cults were a dime a dozen. But yeah, no, I agree with you very much. And yeah, Rand never, aside from everything else, she never truly defines what wealth is, or why, or why it's such a great thing to capture, or you know, the her purported race of creators, whatever they are. It's been a long time since I read The Fountainhead and all of that, so forgive me if I'm stating it. But yeah, no, I agree very much, man. Again, I'm kind of tired. Forgive me for kind of rambling.
No, no problem.